go ahead and be opening to Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1 is where we'll be tonight. We have just every so often in these first couple of months started looking at the book of Jonah on an occasional Sunday night. We spent some time doing the introduction and kind of framing the story and removing some of the common notions that are connected to it. And some of those major notions are, one, that Jonah is about a great fish. It's not. That's a part of the story, but that's not what the story is really about. Nor is it ultimately about his preaching to the Ninevites. Really, I think there are two things that go hand in hand that this book are really about, and that is Jonah is learning a lesson about the deep-seated nature of his prejudice. And in that exchange between him and God, we're seeing a picture of how gracious and patient God is, even with the most stubborn of individuals. And so we're looking at this book because we're looking at this book through the lens of the parable of the prodigal son. Because if you divide the book out, you see the first two chapters, the second two chapters. In the first two chapters, he resembles the prodigal son as he runs away from God. He refuses to do what God would have him to do. And then in the next two chapters, he's the older brother, right? When the Ninevites repent, as did the prodigal son, then he throws a fit, and he's not happy about that. And so as we're thinking about this, we're looking at it tonight under God's pursuit of Jonah. So let's just read chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. Verse 17, I think, should really be the beginning of chapter 2. And so we'll begin in verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out against it for the evil that has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea that the ship threatened to break. The mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? And what is your country? And of what people are you? And he said, I am a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, What is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, What shall we do to you, so that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life. Lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So as we think about this pursuit, we're going to pick up our study in verse 4. And so we left off with Jonah fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Now, that particular phrase, I think, classically has been interpreted the fact that Jonah tried to run from God, and that we should know that you can't run from God. And while I think that's an accurate statement, I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. Jonah, as a prophet of God who's mentioned in 2 Kings 14 and helping Israel prosper through his preaching, Jonah is quite aware that God is omnipresent. He's quite aware that he cannot flee from his presence. And so anytime we're looking at a phrase like this, we have to look at other phrases that are similar and how they're used in the rest of the Old Testament and produce a number of options about what it could mean. And one of the phrases that's very similar to this is being cast out of the sight of the Lord. For an example, we just finished the Kings. In 2 Kings 17 and verse 23, when the 10 northern tribes are taken into captivity, it says they rejected the Lord until he had cast them out of his sight. And so that's a way of saying that he had removed them. They had lost their fellowship with him. And he therefore sent them into captivity. And so it's very possible, and I think it's even more than possible, I think it's very probable that what Jonah is doing, and again, this is one of those books where you have to, it feels like starting from the end and working backward to the beginning might help a little bit more. But one of the things we learn about Jonah is this deep-seated hatred. He says in chapter 4 and verse 2, "This is why I said, was this not what I said when I was in my country? And this is why I didn't want to go to Nineveh, because I knew that you are a gracious and merciful and compassionate God," Exodus 34, 6 and 7, "and I knew that you would forgive them, and I didn't want that." Jonah is telling us who he is, if we'll listen to him. And so it is very possible that Jonah is, quote, fleeing from the presence of the Lord. That is, it's very possible that Jonah is saying, if God will save this wicked people, I want nothing to do with God anymore. It's a very possible interpretation. And I think even more than that, I think it's a very probable interpretation when you look at the rest of the book and how deep-seated his hatred actually is. But this section is where God is pursuing Jonah. God won't give up on Jonah, even though Jonah may have already been trying to give up on him. So you see that our text begins with a word of contrast, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea." This was Jonah's plan. I'm gone, but God has other plans, and so he begins to get his attention. He hurled a great wind upon the sea, a mighty tempest. This particular Hebrew term is used throughout the Old Testament to describe the casting of a spear. God threw it down on the sea. And what makes this peculiar is, from everything we can tell within the book, is that the storm is out of order in many ways. It continually emphasizes the tempestuous nature of it and how that nature continues to grow in intensity. But many times you had people who would not sail during stormy season. And so the fact that these mariners seem to be going about their business and this storm is hurled on them shows you just how peculiar this storm may be, that it comes upon them in a season in which storms were not normal or natural. So this storm is so great that the ship threatened to break up. And this is most likely a commercial ship. You remember it was coming from the port city of Joppa. And even more than that, probably had already done some business in Tyre and Sidon in northern Palestine. So the ship threatened to break up, and therefore the storm is upon them. Well, you know what? I got ahead of myself. Let me lay this out in front of you right here. This chapter is written in what is known as a chiastic structure, and we've talked about these several times before. A chiastic structure is a common Hebrew literary device where the story begins to move. Its movements follow a point, and then it begins to, as the story works itself out, it begins to mirror itself. It begins to repeat the actions. And what is found at the center of that chiastic structure is the writer's way of saying, this is the point I'm trying to communicate to you, and that is that God has not only Jonah's attention, but he also has the sailor's attention. Okay? Because the letter E is where everything comes together. It's coming down to that point, and from that point forward, it's working itself back out and mirroring itself. And so the fear of these individuals, which of course is caused by the intensity of the storm, is here. And so this is just a common way. And again, for an example, bigger stories like this, the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9 is a chiastic structure. The story of Joseph in Genesis 37 through 50 is chiastic in its structure. And so that's what's going on here. So anyway, got ahead of myself on that. So the storm has come. Now, obviously, they're afraid. Okay? So it says the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. Okay? Now these For me, I don't mind the water, but I don't want to creep beyond where I can see land either. And if I'm certainly not going to go out with somebody who doesn't know what he's doing. And if I see a storm start coming when I'm out on the water, my eyes are not going to be on the storm. They're going to be more on the sea captain, the person who's in charge. Why? Because I want to see how he's reacting. If he's calm, it tells me there's nothing abnormal about this. When he starts getting concerned, that's when I start getting concerned. Okay? And so the fact that these men are professionals at this, and this is something that's grabbing their attention, tells us there is intensity here. But they each cry out to their God. Of course, these are polytheistic, or more accurately, henotheistic Gentiles. Henotheism is probably a more accurate term for what we read about in a lot of the Bible. So henotheism is basically where you recognize a lot of other gods, but you have one God that you sit at the top of your pyramid. And that's most commonly known as henotheism. It's slightly different than polytheism. So they're crying out to their gods to deliver them. Now, you have to remember the basic structure of particular idolatrous groups is that their gods are mad at them. And they're always mad at them. And that they have to appease them and get them off their back. Okay? For an example, in Acts chapter 14, when Paul goes into Iconium, is that where he was stoned, or Lystra? One of the two. It's in Acts 14, okay? You remember there that they began to speak, and the people say, oh, these are the gods that have come down to us. And then they begin to try and make an offering to Paul and to his companion Barnabas, and they attribute one being this deity and one being the other deity. Okay, if you research the history of that city, there was this long-held belief that their city had suffered destruction in generations past because the gods came down to them in human flesh, and they did not treat them well, and therefore the city was destroyed. And so now, if you put yourself in their shoes, they think, oh, this has happened again. The gods are here in Paul and Barnabas, so we've got to make a big to-do about it, or our city's going to be sacked again. So there's this concept of God who is someone who has to be appeased. Okay? He does not care for his creation. He's simply a bloodthirsty warlord who is on their backs. And so they're crying out to their gods, and then they begin to hurl their cargo into the sea to lighten it for them. Obviously, that happens in Acts 27. It's a serious matter, because if you're throwing your cargo in, these men are sea traders. What are they throwing in? Their money. It's how they make their living. And so it shows you the serious nature of the storm, that it is basically between living or keeping this stuff that we use to make money and sell and trade with. We'll take the loss because we count our lives more precious than that. And so the storm itself is one that is quite substantial. Now, what's ironic about it all, but Jonah is in the innermost part of the sleep, and he had lain down and was fast asleep. People say, how could you sleep through a storm like that? Well, I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, to say the least. When I was 9 years old in Talladega, Alabama, I laid down, and it was on lap one of a, who was racing that day? I think it was the Busch Series. They were racing. I laid down across two seats in the middle of the heat and went sound asleep and woke up as they were waving the checkered flag on lap 119. And not much has changed. Okay? But furthermore, there is a sense of exhaustion. And I think here one of the things that we're seeing is deep down inside, and I can say this from my own experience, deep down inside, when I know I'm living a way that God does not want me to live, it's an exhausting way to live. As much as I try and act like, it doesn't bother me, deep down inside, my conscience is still there. what I know is still there. And it's still heavy to carry around. And he's been running, and he knows exactly what he's doing. And just the weight of everything coming over him, you can see that he's just passed smooth out. So then the captain comes in and says, "What do you mean, you sleeper? How can you sleep to this?" And he says, "Arise and call out to your God." Now think about the irony of this. You have a Gentile, henotheistic individual telling the prophet of God to call on his God. And furthermore, one of the very things that Jonah does not want to do, he ends up doing in this process. Jonah doesn't want the Gentiles to hear what God has to say, and he ends up introducing Gentiles to God. Okay? So here he is, and you see, and one of the things when we looked at the introduction, one of the things we talked about was Jonah interacts with Gentiles in these two major blocks, first with the mariners and then with the people of Nineveh. And the sad reality is that when you contrast the behavior of the Gentiles with Jonah in chapters 1 and 2 and the Gentiles and Jonah in chapters 3 and 4, it's the Gentiles who outshine Jonah every time. That it's unbelievers who outshine the believer. We'll say some more about that here in a little while. And so they said, "Perhaps your God will give a thought to us so that we may not perish." And so they're looking for release. So now they begin the process. Now that everybody on the boat is there, they begin the process of trying to figure out who caused the storm. So they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we may know." Now, casting lots took on a lot of different things. Sometimes casting of lots is ordained by God, right? Tribal allotments in Joshua. The sin of Achan through tribal allotments. The replacing of Judas by casting lots. All of those types of things. But I think for me, one of the most peculiar things about the casting of lots here, and it could have taken several different things. It could be like drawing straws. It could be like having names or a certain number on something that's similar to some dice that you have, and casting it and seeing how it falls. There's a number of different ways it could have happened. Here's the thing that interests me the most. Not so much about casting of lots. Why does Jonah make them go through this process? Jonah knows good and well where this is from. So why does he make them go through the process of deciding in the casting of lots to reveal who it is that's done wrong that's caused this to come upon them? You know, there was another person in the Old Testament who made Israel cast lots over and over and over again until his sin was exposed. And we mentioned him a minute ago. It's in Joshua chapter 7. His name is Achan. He let the whole nation get before the leaders for Joshua and the leadership, and they had to cast lots to the tribe and then to the clan and then to the family. He never once speaks up and says, "It's me." And so the thing to me that is most puzzling about this is that Jonah does not speak up. Why do they go through this process? He could have ended this thing quickly. Maybe there's a strong sense of stubbornness that's residing inside of Jonah, and the rest of the book would seem to be consistent with that streak of stubbornness. So, the lot falls upon Jonah. And then they begin to ask him questions. Tell us why this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? In these cultures, each occupation had its own patron deity, its own god. And so they're thinking, maybe you have offended the particular god of your occupation. Where do you come from, and where is your country? Again, these deities were viewed as localized and tribal. In 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 28, the Syrians went to war with Israel, and they lost. And they said, here's why we lost. God is a God of the valleys, but he's not a God of the hills. So if we take the fight to the hills, we'll win. they thought gods could be localized and sectioned off like that. So they're asking this particular question. Where do you come from? Of what people are you? Your ethnicity. Maybe you've offended the God of your people. And then Jonah's answer is clear, but it could also be troubling in a way. He says, I'm a Hebrew. The word Hebrew just means to pass over. There's an interesting discussion there between the relationship of the words Hebrew and Jew. You know, we sing, once there were three wandering Jews. They actually are never called Jews. They're Hebrews. They passed over. Jew comes from Judah, which is significantly later. No big deal. It's just ironic to me. But anyway, Hebrew means to pass over. He's identifying with the patriarchs, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm a Hebrew, and I fear the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. The question, and again, when you look at the ending of the book and you look at the way Jonah has a sense of condescension for people who are not Jewish, it changes the way I have to think about everything I see from him. And to be honest with you, if I'm to be brutally honest, even about my own experience with Christian people, I can see a similar attitude that exists in them. There's almost this sense of Jonah looking at these group of sailors and saying, well, I'm a Hebrew. We worship the real God. We're not foolish enough like you people to worship idols. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it is. So the men hear this and they're exceedingly afraid. And they say, what is this you have done? They knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. So now they begin to try and work out a solution. What are we going to do for you that the sea will quiet down for us? The sea is growing and continually growing. It's progressing in its intensity. And so Jonah says, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know that because of me, this great tempest has come upon you. Okay, when you look at Jonah's answer, there's something still that's puzzling to me. One of the first things that's puzzling, one of the things that about this whole interaction that is puzzling to me is really about what is absent. Jonah says, look, this is happening because of me. You can throw me overboard, and this will stop. You never see Jonah stop and pray. Now, he's not the only person to ever be in the midst of a storm. So he does. At no point in this exchange does he stop and pray. Does he ever seek God's forgiveness? Now, what I'm about to tell you, I don't know if this is exactly what he's saying. What I am telling you is it's a possible interpretation of what he's saying. Okay? Again, I go back to chapter 4. You have to have a very dark place in your soul to wish hell and destruction on people. And that's exactly what he confessed about his own heart. His words were, I knew you would forgive them, and that's why I didn't want to tell them. That's deep-seated hatred, which makes me think, what if Jonah says, throw me into the sea? Because I'll die in the sea and I won't have to go to Nineveh. What if that's what he means? That's dark. Think about the level of hatred that would take, if that is indeed what he means. But here again, you see the Gentiles outshine him. He says, throw me into the sea, and what is their reaction? No way. The Hebrew phrase literally means they dug in. They dug into the water. They lowered the sail, they got their oars, and they tried to make it back by hand. Anything. And what you definitely see, however you choose to interpret what is going on, what you definitely see is their respect for human life is far greater on this occasion than Jonah's. Because Jonah is trying to flee from the presence of the Lord so the people will be destroyed by God in Nineveh. They are doing everything within their power to preserve one life. He was doing everything in his power to keep from preserving the lives of thousands of people in a city. They keep rowing, but they cannot because the storm continues in its intensity. Therefore they called out to the Lord and said, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life. Lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. This is when they realize they can't make it, and they pray to God and say, we didn't want to do this. We're doing this as a last resort. So they pick him up, and they hurl him into the sea, and the sea immediately begins to cease from its raging. This whole account is very similar to Mark 4:35-39, where Jesus, you remember, is asleep in the ship and calms the storm. And so it would seem, in my mind anyway, that when it says the sea ceased from its raging, that was a miraculous end to the storm, the same way Mark 4 was. Okay? So the idea is that God has accepted what they have done. And then you have these Gentiles who begin to fear the Lord. It says, then the men feared the Lord exceedingly. Notice Lord is in all capital letters. That's the covenant name for God in the Old Testament. And they offered a sacrifice and made vows. Now, they can make vows on the ship, but I'm just going to take a random shot in the dark here and say they didn't offer a sacrifice on the boat. Number one, they just hurled all their stuff overboard. Number two, a fire on a boat is just not a good idea. Okay? So it's probably more of a holistic statement that says when they made it back to land, they offered their sacrifices. Does this mean they became converts to the Jewish religion? I don't know. I don't see the evidence either way on that. They certainly know that this God is powerful. They've certainly experienced it. They wanted to pay respect to him. But to say they were converted, I mean, there's, number one, that's not really the point of what's going on here. And number two, the evidence is just kind of lacking. So that's God pursuing him. Now, very quickly, let's think about what this means. Number one, God refused to quit on Jonah. Jonah may have been trying to quit and run away, but God wasn't going to let him. And that's an amazing thing, that we can try and run away from God, but God will pursue us. He will pursue us through his people. He'll pursue us continuously through his goodness to us in our lives. We may choose to try and attribute his goodness toward us to other things, but that's still him pursuing us. He's not going to quit on anyone. The parable of the laborers in the vineyard, even up to the 11th hour, he will still be extending himself to people. One of the great ironies to me in Luke 19 when Jesus meets Zacchaeus is Zacchaeus climbs up in the tree because he wanted to see Jesus. You see, that day, Zacchaeus got up thinking, I'm going to pursue and I'm going to find Jesus, and he didn't know that Jesus was coming to find him. He didn't realize it. Number two, There is something in the history of the church that it has many times dubbed common grace. And that is that God bestows the gifts of wisdom and certain insights and goodness and beauty regardless of an individual's religious convictions. That is, there are things that our culture gets right even though they may not be religiously right. Listen, sometimes as religious people, we can position ourselves to say, the whole world is wrong, and you know what? Even how they breathe is wrong. Except that's just not true. Are there people in this world who are legitimately good to other people? And some of them that are not even religious? Yes. And if I haven't ever met some of those people, I need to expand my horizons a little bit. There are good people in this world that theologically, practically, about so many different things, we would never see eye to eye. But you know what? Surely, it's interesting. David Lipscomb wrote an article years and years ago when he was asked a question, what is a sectarian? And he said the true definition of a sectarian is a person who believes that his side is right in every single way and the other side is wrong in every single way and cannot acknowledge a weakness on his side or a positive on the other side. That is the true definition of a sectarian. Listen, we are Christian people. We are Christian people. We're doing our best to do the right thing. But God help us if we think we're at a point where we do everything right, that we don't make mistakes along the way. That's dangerous. It denies the Bible's whole teaching on the sanctification of a believer. That over time we become more and more like Jesus. We're still struggling with sins. How can you read the epistles and say, oh, we won't ever struggle with anything in the church. We've got it all together. When the greatest portion of the New Testament is dedicated to correcting misunderstandings and misbehaviors. Not everything that the world does is wrong. Number 3, it's about our identity. One of the things we know about Jonah from the whole of the book is he was a Jewish prophet. He enjoyed the benefits of Israel. He didn't want anybody else to enjoy them. Where do we find our identity? Well, let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. Number 1, are we blind to certain things? Are you willing to admit that you have a blind spot in your life? Now, if you could see it easily, it wouldn't be a blind spot. Are you willing to admit, am I willing to admit that I may have a blind spot in my life? And listen, if I can't admit that, growth is never going to happen. That even if someone is critical of something that we say or do, if we can't even get out of our skin and get into theirs and try and see the perspective that they are giving to us, that they say we are projecting, that's problematic. A second way we can learn what our identity is is what is it that makes us angry? Or who is it, as some have called it, otherizing? You know, them. They. That group of people. When I'm getting into that type of thinking, I am getting into I should be realizing my identity is placed or misplaced. As if we can, with a broad brush, paint an entire group of people. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had an experience like this? Where someone where you hear someone talking and they say, you know, Christians, they're hypocrites, every one of them. And you say what? Come on now. You know that's not a fair characterization. All right? Church of Christ people. Hard-nosed, mean, every one of them. Come on now. Come on. Come on. You know that's not true. Let me ask you something. If we believe that that kind of fair assessment ought to be extended to us, then why can't we extend that to other people? Because sometimes our identity is in the fact that we are right. And the most important thing to some people is being right. And they have missed the most important thing about being right. And that is, it's not about me being right. It is about what is right. It's about what is right. If I'm on the side of right, great. If I'm not, I need to get myself over there. My identity is misplaced. Next, there is the portion of stubborn rebellion. He just keeps going and keeps running and he's got a stubborn streak. Now, before, again, we are too quick to look at Jonah, before we are quick to jump on him, we need to stop and jump on ourselves. How stubborn can we be? It's like studying the book of Numbers, the children of Israel in the wilderness. And listen, the wilderness is about stubbornness. It's about rebellion. But the amazing thing is we look at that and we go, how could they? Hey, we're supposed to be looking at it saying, how could I? You've never complained about the hand that God has dealt you in life? You've never complained in a moment of frustration? People say, this makes me uncomfortable. It's supposed to. God does not care one bit about our comfort on our morals. He cares that we become like His Son in every way. Jonah has a sense of stubborn rebellion. When I look at him, I have to look at myself and go, what is my stubborn rebellion? And then finally, there's this one that we've talked around and about, and that is God cares how we relate to unbelievers. God cares how we interact with people in the world. Jonah seems to be very condescending. He certainly believes the people of Nineveh to be below him as he walks through this book. And it basically just comes down to this. So when I look at somebody who's lost in sin, do I look at them and think, I'm glad that's not me? Or do I see, but for God's grace, that would be me? And if God in His grace delivered me from that, can I talk to you about how you can do the same thing for you? That's why Paul says to Titus, he says, look, when it comes to experiencing God's grace, remind the brothers that we too were once foolish and deceived and rebellious and hateful. We too were those people. We were them. Don't look at the world and say, pfft, because you were stubborn and you were rebellious and you were hostile and God didn't look at you and go, pfft. He came down in the person of His Son and got down on our level and treated us with dignity and respect. He treated us in a way that called us to live up to the standard of the humanity that God had created in us. That's what God is pursuing in Jonah. He's trying to change him. And you know, every time we study this book, God is pursuing us in it. He's trying to change us. And as I said at the very beginning of this whole study, in the introduction, someone says, this is just not the right reading of Jonah. There's no way this is right. Listen. 10 years ago, I would have agreed with every word you said. As a matter of fact, I did agree with you 10 years ago. But the more time you spend with the book, in honesty and reality, not just about Jonah, but about who we are. We are not the perfect people that we would like ourselves to believe that we are. And there is within us the capability to do things that are not right. And I don't know of any book in Scripture that mirrors that as much as this one. And how God, in His compassion, is pursuing us to change us from the inside out. So maybe tonight you came to services thinking, I'm going to church because I want to be with God. I want to be with His people. I want to know what He has to say. But what if this is another situation like Jonah? What if you came to church tonight thinking, I'm going to pursue what God wants? And maybe in the grand reversal of things, it's actually God who is seeking you. Because that's what's happening. And He's calling us to respond to Him. Never become a Christian to repent of our sins, to confess Christ, to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins. As a New Testament Christian, haven't been faithful. Maybe we're struggling with certain things along the way. Maybe, look, some of this stuff is intensely private. I mean, some of the stuff we talked about tonight is intensely private. And maybe what we need to do is get down on our knees with God and explore what's there. Maybe we want to pray together about it. Maybe we see things in ourselves. Maybe we're just struggling in general. Whatever it is, we want to help each other. If we can, let us know as we stand and sing this song.